The night my in-laws locked me out of my own house, I was standing on the front porch in thin socks, the concrete freezing under my feet, while I could hear them laughing inside like I was a stranger who didn't belong there. And the worst part wasn't the cold, it was the sound of my husband's voice joining theirs. Like everything we built together meant nothing. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew in that moment, was that the house they were so comfortable in was still legally under my control. And what happened next would change everything. If you've ever felt pushed out of your own life, only if this story truly resonates with you, take a second to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always read those comments, and it reminds me I'm not alone in this. My name is Lauren Hayes. I'm 31 years old, and that night was the moment I realized my marriage, my home, and my place in that family were never what I thought they were. And to understand how I ended up standing outside my own front door, you have to go back a few months to when everything still looked normal. It started with a conversation at our small kitchen table, the one we had used for years in our old apartment. Ethan sitting across from me with that calm voice he always used when he wanted something, telling me it was time for us to move into a real house, something bigger, something stable, something we could build a future in. And at first it sounded reasonable. We had both been working hard, saving money, talking about the next step, and when he said his parents might stay with us, just for a little while, I remember pausing, just for a second, my hand still wrapped around my coffee mug, because something about that part didn't feel right. But I didn't push back. Not then, because I trusted him, because I believed that we were a team, and because he looked at me like this was something we were doing together. What I didn't realize was that from that moment on, things had already started shifting in ways I couldn't see yet, because when we began the process of buying the house, it quickly became clear that my financial profile was what made it possible. My credit score, my income verification, my savings for the down payment, all of it was what the lender focused on. And I remember sitting in that office, signing document after document, hearing the agent say things like primary borrower and approved based on your file, and Ethan just nodding beside me, quiet, almost too quiet. But I told myself that was normal, that he was just letting me handle the paperwork. But they didn't know, or maybe they didn't care to understand, that those signatures, those pages, those numbers meant something very specific, something very real. When we finally moved in, the house felt like a dream at first. A 2-story place with wide windows, hardwood floors, and a backyard that caught the late afternoon sun. I remember standing in the living room the first day, looking around and thinking, this is ours. We did this. And for a moment, I was genuinely happy, but that feeling didn't last long, because within the first week, Ethan's parents arrived with more than just suitcases. They came with opinions, routines, and a sense of ownership that didn't match what had actually happened. Denise, my mother-in-law, walked straight into the kitchen on the second day and started rearranging things without asking, moving utensils, switching cabinets, opening drawers like she had lived there for years. And when I gently said, "Oh, I had everything set up a certain way," she just smiled, not unkindly but not kindly either, and said, "You'll get used to a better system." And I remember standing there, holding a dish towel, not sure what to say because it felt small, almost too small to react to. But it stayed with me. Robert, my father-in-law, took over the garage within days, stacking his tools, moving my storage boxes to the side like they were in his way. And when I mentioned that I still needed space there, he laughed lightly and said, "We'll figure it out," like my needs were just a temporary inconvenience. And then there was Jenna, Ethan's younger sister, who started showing up unannounced, bringing friends over, using the living room late into the night, treating the house like a place she could come and go from whenever she wanted. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that this was just an adjustment period, that families needed time to settle. But there were moments, small ones, that didn't sit right, like the way Denise would refer to it as Ethan's house when talking to relatives on the phone, or the way Ethan never corrected her, not once, even when I was standing right there. I remember one evening, about 2 weeks in, I brought it up to him quietly, not as an accusation, just a question, asking if maybe we should set some boundaries, maybe talk to his parents about space, about respect, about how we were all living together now. And he just looked at me, tired, like I was creating a problem where there wasn't one, and said, "They're my family, Lauren. Don't make this a big deal." And that was the first time I felt something shift inside me. Something small but undeniable, like a crack forming in something I thought was solid. But I still didn't see how far it would go. Not yet. Because what happened next, what led to that night on the porch, started with one simple argument that should have never escalated the way it did. And if I had known then what I know now, I would have paid a lot more attention to the way they looked at me that evening, like I was already someone who didn't belong in that house. That argument started in the kitchen, and it should have ended there, quiet, forgettable, like most small disagreements do. But something about that night felt different from the beginning. Denise was standing by the counter, flipping through a stack of takeout menus she had brought home, talking about how the house needed to be run more efficiently. And I remember the way she said it, like it was already her responsibility, like I was just someone passing through. And when she pointed down the hallway and said, "Jenna can take that room, it makes more sense for her," I realized she was talking about my office, the one space I had set aside for my work, the one place that still felt like mine. And for a second I just stood there, trying to understand if she was actually serious, because she said it so casually, like it had already been decided, like my opinion was just a detail that would catch up later. And I looked at Ethan, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he did not. He just kept scrolling on his phone, like he did not even hear it. And that was the moment something in me finally pushed back. I said, calmly at first, "That is my office. I work from there every day." And Denise barely looked at me, just waved her hand slightly and said, "You can work from anywhere. Jenna needs a proper space." And the way she said needs made it sound like my work, my routine, my life was optional, replaceable, something that could be moved around to fit everyone else. And I felt my chest tighten, not from anger, not yet, but from that quiet realization that this was not a misunderstanding. This was a pattern. I turned to Ethan again, my voice a little firmer this time. "Can you tell her that is not happening?" And he finally looked up, but instead of backing me, he sighed, like I was making things harder than they needed to be, and said, "It is just a room, Lauren. Do not turn this into something bigger." And that was it. That was the line that stayed with me, because it was never just a room. It was the first time I saw clearly that in this house, my place was negotiable, and theirs was not. What happened next did not explode all at once. It unfolded slowly, like something tightening around me. Denise started opening cabinets again, louder this time, moving things while I was still using them. Robert turned on the television in the living room at full volume even though I was on a work call. Jenna walked down the hallway with her bags and stopped right outside my office door, looking at it like she was already imagining it as hers. And I could feel the pressure building. The air in the house felt heavier, like every small action was pushing me further out without anyone saying it directly. I remember putting my laptop down, standing up, and walking into the hallway, not rushing, not yelling, just steady. And I said, "No, this is not happening. This room is not available." And for a second, everything went quiet. Not peaceful, but tense. Like the kind of silence that comes right before something shifts. And Denise turned toward me fully this time, her expression different now. Not polite, not dismissive, but sharp. And she said, "You need to understand something, Lauren. This is not just about you." And I felt that sentence land heavy, because it was not about fairness. It was about control. And before I could even respond, Ethan stood up, finally, but not to support me. He stepped between us slightly and said, "Can we just drop this for tonight?" And his tone was not protective. It was tired, almost irritated, like the easiest solution was for me to stop. I did not argue further, not because I agreed, but because I realized arguing in that moment would not change anything. It would only give them more reason to frame me as the problem. So I stepped back, picked up my keys from the table, and said quietly, "I am going to grab something from the car." And no one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay. No one even looked up. And that was the detail that stayed with me later, how easy it was for them to let me walk out. The air outside felt colder than I expected, the kind of cold that settles in quickly. And I remember wrapping my arms around myself as I walked down the driveway, trying to clear my head, telling myself I just needed a minute, just a little space. But there was this feeling, small but persistent, that something was about to happen, something I would not be able to undo. And when I reached my car, I paused, my hand on the door handle, and looked back at the house. The lights were still on, warm, steady, like nothing inside had changed, like the tension I felt was only in my head. And for a second I almost believed that, almost convinced myself I was overreacting, that I could go back in, let it go, keep the peace. But then I remembered the way Denise had looked at me, the way Ethan had dismissed me, and I knew if I walked back in without drawing a line, I might not have a place there at all. I opened the car, reached in to grab my jacket, and as I closed the door, I heard it, the sound that stopped me mid-breath, a soft but unmistakable click from the front door, and at first I did not move, because my brain needed a second to process what that sound meant, and then I turned slowly, my eyes fixed on the house, and I saw it, the handle no longer moving, the door fully shut, locked, and for a moment everything felt still, like time had paused just long enough for me to understand exactly what had just happened. And in that silence, one thought crossed my mind, clear, sharp, and impossible to ignore. They did not just lock the door, they locked me out. I stood there for a few seconds without moving, my hand still holding my jacket, staring at that door like it might open again on its own, like maybe I misunderstood what just happened, but it did not move, and the silence from inside felt louder than anything. Then I heard it, faint at first, voices, laughter, not loud, not cruel in a dramatic way, just normal, casual, like nothing had happened, like I was not standing 5 feet away on the other side of that door. And that was the part that hit the hardest. Not anger, not even embarrassment yet, just this slow, heavy realization that they had made a decision, and they were comfortable with it. I walked back up to the door, not rushing, my steps steady, and I reached for the handle, turned it once, just to be sure, but it did not budge, and I knocked, lightly at first, then a little firmer, not aggressive, just enough to let them know I was there, and for a moment nothing happened. Then I saw a shadow move behind the glass, and Ethan's figure appeared on the other side, blurred through the reflection. He looked at me, just for a second, and I remember thinking he would open the door, that this was some kind of misunderstanding. But he did not reach for the lock. He just stood there, his hand resting on the frame, his expression unreadable, and then he shook his head slightly, not dramatically, just enough for me to understand, and stepped back. I felt something drop inside me, like a weight settling in my chest, and I knocked again, this time a little louder, and said his name, not yelling, just calling, "Ethan," and there was a pause, a long one, and then Denise's voice came from deeper inside the house, clear enough to hear through the door. "She will be fine out there." And I froze, not because of the words themselves, but because of how easily they were said, how certain she sounded, like this was not a moment of conflict. This was a decision already agreed on. I did not argue. I did not shout. I just stood there, my fingers tightening around the edge of my jacket, and I realized something in that moment that I had been avoiding for weeks. This was not about a room, or a misunderstanding, or even a bad night. This was about position, about who had control, about who belonged, and right now, I was the one being pushed out. The cold started to settle in slowly, first in my feet, then in my hands, and I stepped back from the door, not because I was giving up, but because I needed space to think, real space, away from their voices, away from that door, and I walked down the driveway again, this time slower, my mind replaying everything, every small moment that had led here, every time Ethan stayed quiet, every time Denise made a decision without asking, every time I chose to let it go, and it all started to connect in a way it had not before, like pieces falling into place, not suddenly, but clearly. I got into my car and closed the door, and the sound of it shutting felt final, like I had just stepped out of something. I could not go back into the same way. I turned on the heat and sat there, my hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the house through the windshield, the lights still on, shadows moving inside, and for a moment I just breathed, slow, steady, letting the shock settle into something more controlled, something I could actually work with, because panic would not help me, anger would not help me, but clarity might. I reached over to the passenger seat where my bag was and pulled it closer, unzipping it carefully, my fingers still slightly numb, and I took out my phone, Not to call anyone, not yet, but to check something. Something that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind since the day we signed those papers. I opened my email, scrolled past old messages until I found the folder from the lender, the closing documents, the ones I had saved and barely looked at since we moved in, and I tapped on it, the screen lighting up in the dim car. And as I started reading, line by line, slowly, deliberately, I felt that same shift again. But this time it was different. Not a crack, not something breaking, but something solid forming underneath everything else. What they did not know, what they had never bothered to understand, was that the way this house existed, the way it functioned, the way it was financed, was not built around Ethan the way they believed. It was built around me, my name, my income, my responsibility. And I could see it clearly now in the language of those documents, in the structure of the loan, in the details they probably never even asked about. And for the first time since I stepped outside, I did not feel small. I did not feel pushed out. I felt still, grounded, like I was finally standing on something real. I leaned back in the seat and looked at the house again. And the image had changed, not physically, but in my mind. It was no longer just a place I had been locked out of. It was something else entirely, something tied to me in a way they could not just ignore or take over. And I realized that tonight was not the end of anything. It was the moment everything started to become clear. And whatever happened next was not going to be decided by who was inside that house right now. It was going to be decided by what those papers actually meant, and I had a feeling they were about to find out. I did not go back to that door again that night, not because I could not, but because I understood something very clearly now. Knocking would only give them another chance to ignore me, and I was done asking for access to something that already belonged to me. So instead I stayed in the car, the engine running low, the heat slowly pushing back the cold in my fingers, and I kept reading. Every line, every clause, every detail I had skimmed over before, this time slower, more careful, like I was finally seeing it for what it actually was. Not just paperwork, not just something we signed to move forward, but a structure, a system that defined who held real control. I found the section that listed the primary borrower, my name first, clear, undeniable, followed by Ethan's name in a secondary position. And I remembered that meeting, the way the loan officer had explained it, that the approval depended on my financial standing, that the responsibility for the loan rested primarily with me, and at the time it had felt like just another step in the process, something technical, something routine. But now, sitting in that quiet car while my own house stood closed behind me, it felt like something else entirely, something they had never taken the time to understand. What happened next was not emotional. It was deliberate. I opened another file, the payment schedule, the linked account, every transaction coming from my income, my account, my name, and I realized there was a clear trail, a simple one, not hidden, not complicated, just facts. And facts do not argue. They do not shout. They just exist. And that was enough. I checked the time on my phone. It was past midnight now, the neighborhood quiet, most of the houses dark, and for a moment I thought about calling someone, a friend, a hotel, anywhere else, but I did not, because leaving in that moment would feel like giving up ground. I did not need to give, so I stayed, not out of stubbornness, but out of clarity, because I knew I was not the one without options. They were just the ones who thought I was. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes for a few seconds. Not to sleep, just to steady myself. And when I opened them again, I knew what I needed to do next. Not tomorrow, not eventually, but in the morning. The kind of steps that do not rely on emotion, only on process. The first call I made was not to Ethan, not to Denise, but to the lender's support line. I kept my voice calm, steady, explained that I needed to confirm specific details about occupancy and access related to my loan. And the woman on the other end did not react with surprise or confusion. She responded like this was a normal inquiry, walking me through the basics, confirming what I already suspected, that as the primary borrower and responsible party, I had rights tied directly to the property, rights that could not be overridden by someone simply deciding to change a lock or exclude me, and hearing it out loud in a neutral voice made everything feel even more solid. After that, I searched for a local real estate attorney, not randomly, but carefully, reading through reviews, choosing someone who specialized in property disputes and occupancy rights, and I left a message, clear, concise, asking for an urgent consultation in the morning. And as I ended that call, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief, not satisfaction, but direction, which was enough. The sky outside the windshield was still dark, but there was a faint shift at the horizon, the kind that tells you morning is not far away. And I realized I had been sitting there for hours, not frozen, not lost, but working through something that mattered, something real. And the house in front of me no longer looked the same, not because it had changed, but because I had. I was no longer looking at it as someone trying to get back in. I was looking at it as someone who understood exactly what it was tied to. I reached for my phone again and opened my messages, scrolling to Ethan's name, my thumb hovering over the screen for a moment, considering what to say. But then I stopped, because anything I said right now would be wasted. Words would only turn into arguments, and arguments would only blur what was actually very clear. So instead, I locked the phone and set it down, choosing silence, not as avoidance, but as control. Inside the house, the lights were still on, and I could see movement in the living room, shadows crossing the windows. And for a brief second, I wondered if they were thinking about me at all, if Ethan was even aware of what this moment meant, or if they all believed this would pass, that I would come back in the morning, apologize, adjust, fall back into place. And the thought almost made me smile, not because it was funny, but because it showed how little they understood the situation they had just created. They thought locking me out was an ending, a way to put me in my place, but what they did not realize was that they had just crossed a line that shifted everything from personal to structural, from emotional to legal, and once something moves into that space, it does not go back the same way. I looked down at the documents one more time, the names, the numbers, the signatures, and I knew this was not about proving anything to them in words. It was about showing them, clearly, calmly, in a way they could not dismiss or argue with, and that would not happen tonight. It would happen step by step, in the right order, with the right people involved. I turned off the engine for a moment, listening to the quiet, then turned it back on, the heat filling the car again, and I shifted slightly in my seat, settling in for what was left of the night, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I chose to stay, to watch, to understand, to be present in this moment fully, because something had changed, and I was not going to miss what came next. And somewhere between that silence and the slow approach of morning, one thing became completely certain. They had locked me out of the house, but they had no idea they had just given me the reason to take it back on my terms. By the time the first light of morning started to stretch across the sky, I was no longer thinking about what they had done to me. I was thinking about what I was going to do next. And there was a difference between those two things that felt almost physical, like shifting from reacting to deciding, and that shift changed everything. I checked my phone again, not out of habit this time, but with purpose. And there it was, a missed call from Ethan sometime after 3 in the morning. No voicemail, just a single attempt, and I stared at it for a second, not feeling anger, not even disappointment, just a kind of quiet confirmation, because if he had truly understood what he had done, he would have called again, or come outside, or done something more than that one call. But he did not, and that told me everything I needed to know. I unlocked my phone and saw a message from Denise instead, sent just a few minutes earlier. "We should talk calmly when you come back." And I read it twice, noticing the wording, not "when you come home," but "when you come back," like the house was already theirs, like I was the one who had stepped away from something that belonged to them. And for a brief moment, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest again, that instinct to explain myself, to correct the narrative. But I let it pass, because explaining would not change anything, not anymore. I looked up at the house again, the curtains still drawn, the front door still closed, and I realized something simple but important. They were still inside, comfortable, certain, probably thinking this situation would resolve itself the way it always had before, with me adjusting, me compromising, me letting things go. And that assumption was the only reason they had felt bold enough to lock that door in the first place. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small notebook I carried for work, flipping it open to a blank page, and I started writing, Not emotions, not complaints, but steps, clear, simple, in order. Because if there was one thing I had learned from everything leading up to this moment, it was that clarity beats chaos every time. First, confirm all ownership and loan documentation. Second, speak to attorney. Third, arrange for lawful access to property. Fourth, document any interference or obstruction. And as I wrote each line, I felt more grounded, more focused, like I was building something solid out of what had felt like confusion just hours ago. The sun was fully up now, casting a pale light over the street, and I stepped out of the car for a moment, stretching my legs. The cold still there but less biting now, and I looked at the house not as a place I needed to get back into, but as a situation I was about to resolve. And that shift in perspective was subtle, but it changed how I stood, how I breathed, even how I thought. I got back into the car and started the engine again, this time not to sit, but to move, because the next step was already in motion. I checked my phone and saw a return call from the attorney's office, a short message confirming they could see me first thing that morning, and I replied immediately, confirming the appointment, and as I did I noticed something else, another message, this one from Jenna. "Are you seriously making this a big deal?" And I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. The same pattern, minimizing, dismissing, framing me as the one overreacting. And I did not respond, because responding would only pull me back into their version of the situation, and I was done with that. I drove slowly down the street, not leaving the neighborhood entirely, just enough to create distance, enough to clear my head before the next steps, and as I turned the corner, I caught one last glimpse of the house in the rearview mirror, and for a second, I remembered how proud I had felt the day we got the keys, how I had stood in that same driveway thinking this was the start of something stable, something shared, and I let that memory pass, not because it did not matter, but because it was no longer relevant to what I was dealing with now. What mattered now was what could be proven, what could be enforced, what could be made clear in a way that did not depend on anyone's feelings or opinions, and I knew that by the end of the day, things would start to look very different. I parked a few blocks away and sat there for a moment, looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror, my hair slightly out of place, my face pale from the cold, my eyes tired but steady. And I realized that despite everything that had happened, I did not feel broken. I did not feel defeated. I felt aware, and awareness in this situation was more powerful than anything else. I picked up my phone one more time, scrolling back to the documents, rereading the key sections, making sure I understood every detail, because when I walked into that attorney's office, I did not want to be the person explaining what happened emotionally. I wanted to be the person presenting facts, and facts, unlike opinions, do not shift depending on who is speaking. As I sat there, one thought kept repeating quietly in the back of my mind, not loud, not dramatic, just steady. They thought locking me out would end the conversation, but they did not realize it was the moment everything became official, structured, and impossible to ignore. And by the time they understood that, it would already be too late to undo what they had started. I arrived at the attorney's office a few minutes early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted a moment to sit with everything before saying it out loud. Because once I said it, once I laid out the facts, it would stop being just something that happened to me and start becoming something that could be acted on, and that shift mattered. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels structured, intentional, nothing like the tension in that house. And as I sat in the waiting area, I kept my hands still on my lap, not checking my phone, not replaying the night, just letting my thoughts settle into something clear and direct, because I knew I did not need to explain everything. I just needed to explain the right things. When they called my name, I stood up, steady, and followed the assistant down a short hallway into a small office where a man in his 40s stood up to greet me, his tone calm, professional, not overly sympathetic, not dismissive, just focused, and that alone made it easier to speak. I sat down across from him, placed my folder on the desk, and for a moment I did not open it. I just looked at him and said, "I was locked out of a property that I am the primary borrower on," and I watched his expression change slightly. Not dramatic, just attentive, like he understood immediately that this was not just a family issue. This was something with structure. He asked a few questions. Not many, but the right ones. Who is listed on the loan? Who occupies the property? Who made the payments? And as I answered, I kept my voice even, not adding emotion, not explaining feelings, just facts. And with each answer, I could see the picture forming on his side as clearly as it had on mine the night before. I opened the folder and slid the documents toward him, the loan agreement, the payment history, the account statements, and he reviewed them carefully, flipping through each page without rushing. And the room stayed quiet except for the soft sound of paper moving, and that silence felt different from the silence at the door the night before. This one was not dismissive, it was deliberate. After a few minutes, he set the papers down and leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the desk, and said, "You have a strong position here." And those words did not feel like relief. They felt like confirmation, like something I already knew being recognized in a system that mattered. He explained, in simple terms, that what had happened was not just disrespectful. It could be considered interference with lawful access to a property tied directly to my financial obligation, and that distinction was important because it meant this was no longer just about relationships. It was about rights, and rights can be enforced. He outlined the next steps, not dramatically, not aggressively, just clearly. Document everything. Establish formal notice if necessary. Ensure access is restored. And if they refuse, escalate through proper channels. And as he spoke, I wrote everything down, not because I would forget, but because writing it made it real, made it structured, made it something I could follow step by step. At one point, he paused and looked at me more directly and asked, "Do you intend to continue living there with them?" And I did not answer immediately. Not because I did not know, but because I understood what the question really meant. It was not about preference. It was about outcome, about what I was willing to allow going forward. And after a moment, I said, "I intend to regain control of my property first," and he nodded slightly, like that was the answer he expected. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, just a plan forming, clear and grounded. And for the first time since that night, I could see the path forward, not as something uncertain, but as something defined, something that would unfold, based on actions, not reactions. When I left the office, the air outside felt different, not warmer, not lighter, just clearer, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at my phone, seeing the same messages still there, Ethan's missed call, Denise's suggestion to talk calmly, Jenna's dismissal, and none of them felt urgent anymore because the conversation they wanted to have was no longer the one that mattered. I opened a new message to Ethan, my fingers steady, and I typed a single line, not emotional, not confrontational, just precise. "We will be addressing the situation today with proper documentation," and I sent it without adding anything else, because anything more would only invite the kind of response I was no longer interested in engaging with. A few seconds later, the typing indicator appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again, and I watched it without reacting, because whatever he was about to say would not change what had already been set in motion. I put my phone back in my bag and started walking toward my car, my steps measured, not rushed, and as I reached the driver's seat, I paused for a second, my hand on the door handle, and looked out at the street, people moving through their morning, normal, unaware, and I realized something simple but important. Nothing about this situation required chaos. Nothing required me to lose control or raise my voice, because the strength of my position was not in how I reacted. It was in what I could prove and what I could enforce. I got into the car and closed the door, the sound firm, steady, and I started the engine, not to leave the situation behind, but to move directly back toward it, because now, for the first time since I stood on that porch, I was not returning as someone trying to be let in. I was returning as someone who understood exactly what needed to happen next, and the difference between those two things was everything. I drove back slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to arrive exactly the way I intended to, calm, clear, and fully in control of what came next. And as the house came back into view at the end of the street, nothing about it looked different. The same driveway, the same front windows, the same quiet suburban stillness. But I knew something had shifted, not outside, but inside the structure of what that place actually meant. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, sitting there for a second, with my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping it, not tense, just steady. and I looked at the front door, the same one that had been closed on me hours earlier, and I noticed something small. The lock had been changed, the metal slightly brighter, newer than the rest of the hardware, and that detail alone told me everything I needed to know. They had not just reacted in the moment, they had made a decision. A deliberate one, and that decision had consequences. I stepped out of the car and closed the door behind me, the sound firm but not loud, and as I walked up the driveway, I could already feel their awareness shifting inside the house, like they knew I was back, even before I knocked. And when I reached the front door, I did not touch the handle this time. I did not test it. I did not knock. I just stood there for a moment, listening, and then I raised my hand and knocked once, slow, measured, not demanding entry, but announcing presence. There was movement inside almost immediately, footsteps, quick, uneven, and then the door opened halfway, not fully, just enough for Denise to look out, her expression controlled but not relaxed, and for a second we just looked at each other. No greeting, no pretense, just acknowledgement. And then she said, "We were just about to talk," and her tone carried that same calm framing as her message earlier, like this was still something she could manage, still something she could shape into her version of events. I did not respond to that. I did not step forward. I simply said, "I am not here to talk," and I watched the slight shift in her face, not dramatic, just a small tightening around her eyes, the kind that happens when control starts to slip. Behind her, I could see movement again. Robert standing near the hallway, Jenna on the couch, her arms crossed, and then Ethan stepped into view, his posture uncertain, not fully defensive, not supportive either, just there, and for a brief moment our eyes met, and I could see it, confusion, tension, something unsettled, like he realized this was not going the way he expected. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, holding it steady, not as a threat, not as a gesture, just as something that existed, something real, and I said, "You changed the lock and denied me access to a property that I am legally responsible for," and the words landed differently than anything I had said before, because they were not emotional, they were precise, and precision leaves less room to dismiss. Denise opened the door a little wider now, her tone sharpening slightly. "Lauren, you are overreacting. We just needed space last night." And I let a second pass before responding, not interrupting, not raising my voice, just allowing the silence to hold for a moment. And then I said, "You interfered with my lawful access to a property tied to my loan obligations," and as I spoke, I saw it, the first real break in her confidence. Not fear, not yet, but uncertainty, because this was not the language she was expecting. Ethan stepped forward slightly, his voice lower, more cautious. "Can we just go inside and talk about this?" And I shook my head once, not dismissively, but clearly. "No." And that single word seemed to land heavier than anything else, because it was not part of the pattern they were used to. I was not negotiating. I was not adjusting. I was stating. I took a small step back from the doorway, not retreating, but creating space, and I said, "I have already consulted legal counsel this morning." And the room behind Denise went still, not silent in the same way as before, but attentive, focused, and I continued, "This situation is now documented, and I will be proceeding with formal steps to ensure access and control are restored." And I did not rush those words. I let each part settle, because they needed to understand that this was no longer a discussion, it was a process. Jenna shifted on the couch, her voice cutting in, "This is ridiculous. You are making this way bigger than it is." And I turned my head slightly toward her, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the sound, and then I looked back at Denise, because she was the one who needed to understand this most clearly, and I said, "What you think it is does not change what it is." And that was the moment the dynamic shifted, not dramatically, not with raised voices, but in the space between us, in the way no one immediately responded, in the way Ethan's posture changed slightly, like he was starting to see something he had not considered before. I did not step inside. I did not ask to. I simply stood there, steady, holding the folder, letting the situation settle into what it had become, and for the first time since I walked up to that door, I was not the one waiting for a response. They were, and that difference, quiet as it was, changed everything. Denise did not respond immediately, and that pause, that small gap where she had nothing ready to say, was the first real sign that the situation was no longer under her control, and I could see her trying to adjust, trying to find a way to bring it back into something familiar, something she could manage. And when she finally spoke, her voice had changed, still calm, but tighter now. "Lauren, this is not necessary. We are family. We can handle this without turning it into something formal." And I listened to her carefully, not interrupting, because this was the part where they would try to pull it back into emotion, into relationship, into something that could be softened or dismissed. And when she finished, I said, "You made it formal when you denied me access." And I kept my tone even, not sharp, not raised, just steady, because the strength of what I was saying was not in how it sounded, it was in what it meant. Ethan stepped closer to the door now, his hand resting lightly against the frame, his eyes moving between me and the folder I was holding, and he said, "We did not think it was that serious. It was just for the night." And I looked at him for a second, really looked, and I realized something I had not fully allowed myself to see before. This was not just about his parents. This was also about him choosing not to understand, choosing not to ask, choosing to let things happen without questioning them. And I said, "You did not think about what it meant, but that does not change what it is." And I watched the way his expression shifted, not defensive, not fully apologetic, just uncertain, like he was standing in a place he did not recognize. Robert cleared his throat from behind Denise, stepping forward slightly, his voice lower, more measured. "What exactly are you saying you are going to do?" And that question, more than anything else, told me they were starting to understand this was no longer just a disagreement. It was something with direction, and I answered him directly. "I am restoring access to the property and documenting any interference moving forward." And I let that sit there, not explaining further, not expanding, because the more precise it stayed, the harder it was to argue with. Jenna shifted again, her tone sharper now. "This is unbelievable. You are acting like we broke the law or something." And I did not look at her this time. I kept my focus on Denise and Robert, because they were the ones making decisions, and I said, "Intent does not change impact." And for a moment, no one spoke, and that silence was different from the others. It was not dismissive, not tense, it was processing, and I could see it happening in small ways. The way Denise's posture changed slightly, the way Robert's eyes moved toward the documents in my hand, the way Ethan stepped back just a little, creating space where before there had been none. I reached into the folder and pulled out a single page, not the entire stack, just one, and I held it up, not pushing it toward them, not forcing it into their space, just making it visible. And I said, "This outlines my role as the primary borrower and responsible party." And I did not need to say more than that, because the words themselves carried weight they could not ignore. Denise looked at the page but did not take it, her eyes scanning it from a distance, and I could see the calculation in her expression, the shift from assumption to uncertainty. And she said, more quietly now, "We did not know that." And I nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, because whether they knew or not was no longer the point. Ethan spoke again, his voice softer. "So what happens now?" And that question, simple as it was, marked the moment everything had fully turned, because it was no longer about whether I should be let back in, it was about what came next, and I answered him the same way I had answered everything else, clearly, without emotion. "The lock will be changed back, access will be restored immediately, and we will establish clear terms for who is allowed to stay here." And I watched the words settle, not rushed, not forced, just placed into the space between us. Denise's lips pressed together slightly, and for a second, I thought she might push back again, might try to reframe it, but she did not. She just stepped back from the doorway a little, her hand moving toward the edge of the door as if she was no longer sure how wide to keep it open. And that hesitation was all the confirmation I needed. I did not move forward. I did not step inside. I simply waited, not impatiently, not demanding, just present, because now the next action was theirs, not mine, and that shift, subtle as it was, meant everything, because the power in that moment was not in forcing entry. It was in knowing I did not have to. Behind her, Robert spoke again, quieter this time. "We need to look at this," and Denise nodded slightly, almost automatically. And then she looked back at me, her expression no longer dismissive, no longer certain, and said, "Give us a moment." And I inclined my head once, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging the request, and stepped back from the doorway, creating the space they needed. Because I understood something now that I had not before. Control does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience, like letting the other side catch up to a reality that has already shifted. As the door closed, not locked this time, just closed, I stood there on the porch again, but it did not feel the same. The cold was still there, the air still sharp, but I was not the same person standing in it. And as I waited, I knew that whatever happened when that door opened again, it would not be the same situation I had walked into the night before. Because now they understood, at least in part, that they were no longer deciding whether I belonged there. They were reacting to the fact that I did. The door stayed closed longer than I expected, not in a dramatic way, just long enough for the silence to stretch, long enough for me to feel the weight of what was happening on the other side, quiet voices, footsteps moving across the floor, a chair shifting slightly, and I stood there without moving, not checking my phone, not pacing, just waiting, because for the first time in all of this, I was not waiting for permission, I was waiting for them to understand. When the door finally opened again, it was slower this time, more controlled, and Denise stepped forward first. But she did not stand in the doorway the same way as before. She moved slightly to the side, not fully inviting but no longer blocking, and that small change said more than anything she could have said out loud. Robert stood just behind her, his expression more serious now, less certain, and Ethan was there too, but quieter, his posture pulled back, like he was no longer sure where he stood in this space, and for a moment no one spoke. And that silence felt different again, not tense, not dismissive, but measured, like everyone was choosing their words more carefully now. Denise was the first to speak, her voice steady but softer. "We have looked at the document," and she gestured slightly toward the paper still in my hand, and I nodded once, not encouraging, not dismissing, just acknowledging, and she continued. "We did not realize the structure of the loan was set up that way," and I listened, not interrupting, because what mattered now was not what they said, but how they said it, and there was a shift there, subtle but clear. The certainty from before was gone, replaced with something closer to caution. Robert stepped forward slightly, his voice lower, more direct. "If what you are saying is accurate, then we need to correct the situation." And I held his gaze for a moment, because that sentence mattered, not just the words, but the acceptance behind them. And I said, "It is accurate." And I did not add anything else, because I did not need to. The documents had already done that work. Ethan finally spoke, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "Lauren, I did not think it would go this far." And I looked at him, not with anger, not with softness either, just with clarity. And I said, "It went this far when you chose not to stop it." And the words were not sharp, but they were final. And he did not respond. He just looked down for a second, like he understood something he had been avoiding. Denise shifted her weight slightly, her hands coming together in front of her. And she said, "We can change the lock back." And I noticed how she said it, not as a favor, not as a negotiation, but as a correction. And I nodded once. That is the first step. And again, I kept it simple, because simplicity leaves less room for confusion. There was another pause, shorter this time, and then Robert said, "We will also need to discuss living arrangements." And I recognized that shift immediately, from reaction to adjustment, from defending their actions to considering the consequences, and I said, "Yes, we will." But I did not elaborate yet, because that conversation had not fully arrived, not until access was restored. Denise stepped back further from the door now, opening the space completely. And for the first time since I had walked up the driveway, there was nothing physically blocking me from entering. But I did not move right away. I stayed where I was for a second, not out of hesitation, but because I understood the importance of that moment, the transition from being outside to stepping back in, not as someone asking, but as someone returning on her own terms. I took one step forward, then another, crossing the threshold slowly, deliberately, and as I did, I felt the shift, not just in the room, but in myself. The house felt the same furniture, the same light, the same arrangement, but the meaning of it had changed completely, because I was no longer navigating their space, I was standing in mine. Jenna remained on the couch, her arms still crossed, but her expression had changed. Less confrontational, more uncertain, like she was no longer sure what role she played in this, and she did not speak, which in itself was a change. I walked past them without rushing, setting my bag down on the table where it had been the night before, and I placed the folder beside it, not hiding it, not emphasizing it, just leaving it there as a presence, something that existed whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Ethan moved slightly closer, his voice low. "We should talk about how to move forward." And I turned to face him, meeting his eyes fully this time, and I said, "We will, but not like before." And he nodded slowly, like he understood that meant something very specific, something that would not be negotiated away. Denise looked around the room, then back at me and said, "We will arrange for the lock to be changed today," and I inclined my head slightly. Good. And that was all. No gratitude, no tension, just acknowledgement, because this was not about winning or losing, it was about restoring something that should not have been taken in the first place. As the room settled into this new quiet, I realized something that had not been clear before. This was not the end of the situation, not even close. It was just the point where the illusion had been removed, where everyone could see the structure underneath, and once that happens, things do not go back to the way they were. They either adjust or they break. And standing there, in that familiar space that no longer felt the same, I knew we were only at the beginning of whatever came next. The house felt quieter after that, not because there were fewer people in it, but because something unspoken had settled over everyone, like a shift in air pressure that made every movement more deliberate, every word more measured, and I noticed it immediately in the way Denise moved through the kitchen, no longer opening cabinets without looking, no longer rearranging things absent-mindedly, but pausing, checking, as if she was suddenly aware that the space around her was not as unquestioned as it had been before. I stayed in the living room for a while, not sitting down right away, just standing near the table where I had placed my bag and the folder, letting the moment settle, because I knew that what happened next would not come from confrontation. It would come from structure, from clarity, from the decisions that followed this silence. Ethan hovered nearby, not too close, not too far, like he was trying to find a place to stand that would not create more tension, and after a few seconds, he said quietly, "I did not think it would turn into this." And I looked at him, really looked this time, and I saw something I had not seen before, not strength, not certainty, but hesitation. And I said, "It did not turn into this. It was already this. You just did not stop it." And he nodded slightly, not arguing, not defending himself, just accepting that there was nothing to say that would undo what had already happened. I moved toward the kitchen then, not asking, not announcing, just walking into the space that had been slowly taken from me over the past few weeks, and I opened one of the cabinets, the one Denise had rearranged earlier, and for a second I just looked at it, the way everything had been shifted into her system, her logic, her structure, and without rushing, without making a scene, I started placing things back where they had been before, not aggressively, not dramatically, just methodically, and I could feel her watching me from behind, not interrupting, not correcting, just observing, and that alone told me more than anything she could have said. Robert stood near the doorway, his posture more reserved now, his voice quieter when he finally spoke. "We will need to sit down and talk about how long we are staying here," and I turned slightly toward him, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the question. And I said, "Yes, we will define that clearly." And I chose that word deliberately, define, because this was no longer about assumptions or expectations, it was about terms. Jenna did not say anything at first, but I could see the tension in her posture, the way she shifted slightly on the couch, and after a moment she said, "I did not know it was set up like that," and her tone was different now, less confrontational, more uncertain, and I nodded once, not to reassure her, but to acknowledge the statement, because again, whether they knew or not, did not change what was already in place. I finished adjusting the last item in the cabinet and closed it gently, not with emphasis, not to make a point, just because it was done, and then I turned back toward the room, taking in the space again, and everything looked the same, but it did not feel the same, because now every object, every room, every corner of that house had context, had structure, had definition, and that changed how everyone moved within it. Ethan stepped closer then, his voice still low. "What do you want to do about us?" And that question hung in the air for a moment, not because it was unexpected, but because it was the first time he had asked something that was not about managing the situation, but about facing it, and I did not answer right away, not because I did not know, but because I understood that whatever I said next would not just define the next few hours, it would define everything that came after. I looked at him for a second, then said, "Right now, I am focusing on restoring structure." And I saw the way he processed that, the slight shift in his expression, because it was not the answer he expected. It was not emotional, it was not relational, it was practical, and that made it harder to respond to. Denise moved slightly then, stepping fully into the kitchen, her hands resting lightly on the counter, and she said, "We will cooperate with what needs to be done." And I turned my head toward her, meeting her gaze briefly, and said, "That is necessary." And again, I kept it simple, because simplicity does not leave space for misinterpretation. The rest of the morning unfolded in small, quiet actions. No arguments, no raised voices, just adjustments. Denise making a call about the lock, Robert stepping outside briefly to speak with someone on his phone, Jenna staying mostly silent, and Ethan moving through the space like he was trying to understand it again, like it had become something unfamiliar overnight. I stayed present through all of it, not directing, not controlling, just observing, because the structure was already in place. It did not need to be forced. It just needed to be followed. At one point, I picked up the folder again and placed it on the counter where everyone could see it more clearly. Not as a reminder, not as a threat, just as something that existed, something that defined the reality we were now operating within. And no one questioned it. No one dismissed it, which in itself was a shift. As the hours passed, I realized something that had not been obvious before. Control does not always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from removing the illusion that something can be controlled by someone else. And once that illusion is gone, everything else starts to realign on its own. Not perfectly, not immediately, but inevitably. And standing there, in a house that felt both familiar and completely different at the same time, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by what they wanted it to be. It would be shaped by what had already been established. And that was something none of them could ignore anymore. By early afternoon, the house no longer felt like a shared space pretending to work. It felt like a place in transition, and that difference showed in small, quiet ways. Denise no longer moved freely between rooms without pausing. Robert kept his conversations low and brief, and Jenna stayed mostly in one place, scrolling on her phone, glancing up occasionally like she was still trying to understand how things had shifted so quickly. The locksmith arrived just after 1, a calm, middle-aged man who stepped out of his van with a small toolkit and a neutral expression, not curious, not intrusive, just focused on his job, and I met him at the door before anyone else could speak, explaining clearly that the front lock needed to be replaced and access restored, and he nodded without asking unnecessary questions, because to him, this was simple, a service request, not a family conflict. Ethan stood nearby as the man worked, his hands in his pockets, his posture uncertain, and I could feel his attention on me without him saying anything, like he was waiting for a moment to speak but not sure how to begin. And when the old lock came off, placed carefully into the locksmith's tray, I felt a quiet sense of finality, not dramatic, not emotional, just a recognition that something physical had been undone, something that had been used to draw a line that no longer existed. The new lock clicked into place with a clean, precise sound, and the locksmith handed me the keys first, not as a gesture, just as procedure, and I took them without hesitation, feeling the weight of them settle in my hand, and for a second, I looked at them, not because they were important on their own, but because of what they represented, not ownership, not control in the way Denise had tried to take it, but access, rightful, structured, defined. When the locksmith left, the door closed behind him, and the house felt different again, quieter in a more settled way, like something had been corrected, and Denise stepped forward slightly, her voice measured, "We will need copies of the new keys." And I looked at her for a moment, not long, just enough to acknowledge the request, and I said, "We will define access after we finalize arrangements." And I saw the way that landed, not rejected, but deferred, placed into a structure she no longer controlled. Robert spoke next, his tone more practical now, We have been looking at options for other places, and I nodded slightly because that was the next step, the natural one, not forced, not demanded, just necessary, and I said, "That makes sense," and again I kept it simple, because simplicity was what kept everything clear. Ethan finally stepped closer, his voice low. "Lauren, can we talk privately?" And I considered it for a moment, not avoiding, not rushing, just weighing what that conversation would actually be. And then I nodded once and walked toward the hallway, not inviting him, but allowing the space for that conversation to happen. We stood just outside what had been my office, the door still closed, and for a second neither of us spoke. And then he said, "I should have handled things differently." And I listened, not reacting immediately because I had heard similar words before, in different forms, and what mattered now was not what he said, but what he understood. And I asked, "What do you think you should have done?" And he paused, longer this time, his eyes shifting slightly as he thought, and then he said, "I should have made it clear that this was your house too." And I watched him for a second, then said, "It was not about making it clear. It was about not letting it become unclear in the first place." And that difference seemed to settle over him, because he did not respond right away. He just nodded slowly, like he was starting to see the gap between intention and action. I reached for the doorknob of the office and opened it, stepping inside, and the room looked exactly the way it had the night before, except for one thing, the feeling of it, and I walked to the desk, placing my hand lightly on the surface, not claiming it, not emphasizing it, just reconnecting with something that had been pushed aside. And I said, "This space stays as it is," and my voice was not raised, not defensive, just clear. And he nodded again, quietly, "Yes." And that was the end of that part of the conversation, because there was nothing more to negotiate there. When we stepped back into the main area, Denise and Robert were already speaking in low voices, looking at something on Robert's phone, and Jenna had moved closer to them, her posture less rigid now, more attentive, and I could see the shift fully now, not just in tone, but in direction. They were no longer acting within the assumption that they could stay indefinitely. They were adjusting to the reality that they would not. The rest of the afternoon moved forward in quiet, practical steps, calls being made, timelines being discussed, not loudly, not confrontationally, but with a kind of restrained urgency. Like everyone understood that something had changed, and it could not be ignored, and I stayed present through all of it, not leading, not stepping away, just ensuring that the structure remained intact. As the sun began to lower, casting longer shadows across the floor, I stood near the front door for a moment, the new key in my hand, and I looked at the space around me, the same walls, the same furniture, the same arrangement, but everything felt different now, not because of what had been taken, but because of what had been clarified. And in that quiet, steady awareness, I understood something that had not been obvious before. This was not just about being let back in. It was about never allowing myself to be placed outside again. Not physically, not structurally, not in any way that could be defined without my consent. And that understanding settled in deeper than anything else that had happened so far. The house is quiet now, in a way it never was before. Not because it is empty, but because everything inside it finally feels defined, measured, understood, and in the weeks that followed, Denise and Robert found another place, something smaller, something that belonged entirely to them. Jenna stopped coming by without asking, and Ethan and we stopped pretending that things could go back to how they were, because the truth is, once something is revealed clearly, you cannot unsee it, you cannot return to comfort built on misunderstanding. I still live here, in the same house, in the same rooms, but it feels different now, not warmer, not colder, just honest, and that honesty brought a kind of peace I did not know I was missing, the kind that does not come from everything being perfect, but from everything being real. Ethan and I had conversations after that, long ones, quiet ones, not filled with arguments, but with realizations, and in the end, we chose to step back from each other, not in anger, not in resentment, but in clarity. Because sometimes love is not enough to hold something together when respect has been compromised, and I learned that letting go can be just as important as holding on. There are still moments, small ones, where I remember that night, standing outside in the cold, hearing voices on the other side of the door, and I do not feel anger anymore when I think about it, I feel something else, something steadier, something like recognition, because that night did not break me. It showed me something I needed to see, something I had been ignoring, something my intuition had been quietly trying to tell me for a long time. I learned that boundaries are not something you ask for, they are something you establish, and if you do not define them clearly, someone else will define them for you, often in ways that do not serve you. And I learned that love without respect becomes imbalance, and imbalance always finds a way to reveal itself, sooner or later. If there is one practical thing I would tell anyone listening, it is this: understand what you are signing, understand what you are building, financially, emotionally, structurally, because your independence is not just about how you feel, it is about what you can stand on when everything else shifts. And do not ignore the small moments, the ones that feel slightly off, the ones that make you pause for just a second, because those moments are often your intuition speaking before your mind is ready to accept it. I also believe, in a quiet way, that there is something greater guiding us through the moments we do not understand at the time, whether you call it God, or the universe, or simply your inner voice. There is a kind of protection and clarity, even when it arrives in uncomfortable ways. And that night, as painful as it was, might have been exactly what I needed to step into a life that is more honest, more grounded, more my own. And if you are listening to this right now, and you feel like you have been pushed out of your own space, your own relationship, your own sense of self, I want you to know this: you are not overreacting for wanting respect, you are not difficult for needing clarity, and you are not wrong for choosing yourself when something no longer aligns with your worth. You do not have to shout to be heard. You do not have to fight to prove your value. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand still, see clearly, and move forward with intention. Healing does not happen all at once. It happens in small decisions, in quiet moments, in choosing not to go back to what hurt you, and in building something new, even if it is just within yourself at first. Thank you for being here, truly, for listening, for staying through this story, because sharing it is not just about telling what happened, it is about connecting with someone out there who might need to hear that they are not alone, that clarity is possible, that strength can be quiet, and that sometimes the moment you feel most pushed out is the moment you begin to find your way back to yourself. If this story stayed with you in any way, you can share where you are listening from, or simply pass it along to someone who might need it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, you can stay connected here, but more than anything, take care of yourself, protect your boundaries, trust your instincts, and do not let anyone define your place in your own life. My name is Lauren Hayes. I am 31 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is simple: never give someone else the power to make you feel like you do not belong in what you built.